a small green fruit harvested from vines in the karst mountains of southern China, produces a sweetness 250 times more potent than sugar, with no calories, no impact on blood glucose, and no insulin response. It has been used for centuries in the region where it grows, dried and brewed into teas, valued not for nutrition but for sweetness that required no cane, no bees, no refining. Buddhist monks cultivated it in temple gardens. Families in remote valleys harvested it from wild vines. It never spread, not because it failed, because it could not be moved. The fruit rotted within days of harvest. The vines refused to grow beyond a single climate zone, and the knowledge of how to process it remained local, unwritten, passed from hand to hand in a language the rest of the world did not speak. There is a fruit that contains no sugar. Not in the way that most people understand sugar. It contains carbohydrates. It contains fructose and glucose in small amounts, as most fruits do. But the sweetness, the intense, clean sweetness that the fruit is known for, does not come from sugar at all. It comes from compounds called Mogrosides. Mogrosides are glycosides, molecules built from chains of glucose attached to a triterpene backbone. They taste sweet to the human tongue, extraordinarily sweet, but the body does not metabolize them as sugar. They pass through the digestive system largely unabsorbed. They do not raise blood glucose. They do not trigger insulin release. They provide sweetness without the metabolic cost. This is rare. Among naturally occurring compounds, only a handful provide intense sweetness without calories. Most are synthetic. A few, like steviol glycosides from stevia, are plant-derived but recently discovered. This fruit has been known for centuries. The sweetness is difficult to comprehend in numerical terms, but the measurements are consistent. Depending on the concentration of Mogrosides, the fruit is between 150 and 250 times sweeter than table sugar, gram for gram. A single fruit, no larger than a tennis ball, dried and steeped in water, can sweeten a liter of liquid to the level of heavily sugared tea. A small fragment of the dried flesh, crushed and added to food, replaces tablespoons of sugar. This is not mild sweetness. This is sweetness so concentrated that the fruit cannot be eaten fresh without overwhelming the palate. The traditional method of consumption, developed over centuries, was to dry it, boil it, and dilute the resulting liquid until the sweetness became palatable. And for hundreds of years, this fruit was known only in the valleys where it grew, a narrow band of subtropical mountains in southern China, where the climate, the soil, and the seasonal rhythms aligned in ways that could not be replicated elsewhere. The historical record, such as it exists, is written in Chinese. The fruit appears in texts from the Yuan and Ming dynasties, mentioned in regional herbals and pharmacopoeias as something used in the Guangxi region. The descriptions are practical. The fruit is dried, boiled, and consumed as a tea. It is described as sweet, as cooling, as something given to those suffering from heat-related ailments or coughs. The fruit's common name in Chinese, luo hanguo, translates roughly to arhat fruit or monk fruit. Arhat is a term from Buddhism, referring to one who has achieved enlightenment. The name reflects the fruit's association with Buddhist monks, who reportedly cultivated it in temple gardens in the mountains of Guangxi. The monks understood that the vines required specific conditions: shade, but not too much; humidity, but not stagnant air; support structures, trellises or trees for the vines to climb; the fruit set only after successful pollination, which in wild populations was carried out by insects, but in cultivated settings often required human intervention. The fruit matured in autumn. When ripe, it was harvested, and the process of drying began immediately. Fresh, the fruit had a shelf life measured in days. The flesh, high in moisture, fermented rapidly if not preserved. Drying halted decomposition and concentrated the Mogrosides, turning the fruit into a stable product that could be stored for months or even years. Dried fruit was traded within the region, sold in markets, used in households. But it did not travel beyond Guangxi and the neighboring provinces. The fruit was unknown in northern China. It was unknown in Japan, in Korea, in Southeast Asia. It remained a regional specialty, limited not by secrecy but by biology. The vines did not transplant well. Attempts to grow them outside their native range failed. The climate was too dry, or too cold, or lacked the seasonal cues that triggered flowering. The soils, formed from the karst limestone that defines the Guangxi landscape, had a chemistry that could not be easily duplicated. And even within Guangxi, cultivation was difficult. Yields were unpredictable. A vine might produce abundantly one year and sparsely the next. Pests and diseases affected the fruit. Typhoons common in the region damaged the vines. The fruit was valuable, but it was not abundant enough to become a major trade good. It was not calorie-dense like grain. It was not essential like salt. It was a sweetener, a luxury in a time and place where sweetness was not considered a necessity. The knowledge of how to cultivate it, how to dry it, how to prepare it, remained local. It was not written in texts aimed at a national audience. It was not part of the imperial agricultural canon. It was the knowledge of mountain farmers and monks, transmitted orally, demonstrated in practice, and confined to the valleys where the fruit grew. And so it stayed. For centuries, while sugarcane spread across the tropics, while honey sustained civilizations, while Europeans learned to extract sugar from beets and built empires on the sweetness of colonial plantations, this fruit remained in its mountains, known to those who lived there and invisible to the rest of the world. The fruit did not fail to spread. The systems that spread other foods, trade networks, colonial expansion, agricultural improvement programs, could not accommodate a fruit that spoiled within days of harvest and grew only in a single, inaccessible region. Sugarcane could be planted across the tropics. It was hardy, productive, and easily processed. Beets could grow in temperate Europe. Honey could be harvested anywhere bees and flowers coexisted. These were sweeteners that scaled. This fruit did not scale. The vines required hand labor. They could not be mechanized. Harvesting the fruit meant climbing trellises or trees, selecting ripe fruit by color and feel, and carefully removing it without damaging the flesh. There was no way to do this quickly. There was no way to do this with machines. The fresh fruit could not be shipped. Even with refrigeration, unavailable until the 20th century, the fruit deteriorated rapidly. Drying required heat, airflow, and time. It was done in the sun, on racks, by families who had learned the process from their parents. Industrial drying technology, which might have allowed centralized processing, did not reach rural Guangxi until decades after it had transformed food systems elsewhere. And the fruit itself resisted improvement. There were no wild relatives to crossbreed. There were no genetic bottlenecks to exploit for uniformity or higher yields. The plant had not been domesticated in the way that wheat, rice, or maize had been domesticated. It remained essentially wild, cultivated, but not controlled. By the time the Western world encountered the fruit in the mid-20th century, it had already been classified. Not as food, as an herbal remedy, a curiosity, something documented by ethnobotanists and mentioned in surveys of traditional Chinese medicine. Western food science, at that time, had little interest in obscure regional sweeteners. Sugar was cheap, abundant, and industrially optimized. Synthetic sweeteners, saccharin, cyclamat, aspartame, were being developed for consumers who wanted sweetness without calories. There was no economic incentive to investigate a fruit that could not be grown outside a single Chinese province and required labor-intensive processing. And so the fruit remained marginal, known to specialists, used locally. But absent from global commerce, absent from scientific literature, absent from the awareness of populations that consumed sugar by the ton and artificial sweeteners by the gram, The knowledge of how to process it, how to extract the Mogrosides in concentrated form, did not exist outside the traditional drying and boiling methods. Modern extraction chemistry, capable of isolating specific compounds, of producing standardized extracts, was not applied to this fruit until the late 20th century. And even then, the application came slowly. By the 1980s, food chemists in China and Japan had begun analyzing the fruit in earnest. The Mogrosides were identified and characterized. There are several types: Mogroside V, IV, V, and others, each with slightly different sweetness intensity and stability. Mogroside V, the most abundant in ripe fruit, is the primary contributor to sweetness. Chemical analysis confirmed what traditional use had demonstrated. The Mogrosides are intensely sweet. Measurements place them at 150 to 250 times the sweetness of sucrose, depending on purity and concentration. They are heat-stable, maintaining sweetness even when boiled or baked, unlike some other natural sweeteners that degrade under heat. They do not raise blood glucose. When consumed, Mogrosides pass through the stomach and small intestine largely intact. They are not absorbed into the bloodstream in significant amounts. Some are metabolized by gut bacteria in the colon, but they do not contribute calories or affect insulin levels in the way that sugar does. This made the fruit of interest to researchers studying diabetes and metabolic health. Not as a treatment, careful studies have been conducted, but the fruit is not medicine, but as a tool. A way to provide sweetness to populations that needed to limit sugar intake. The Mogrosides also showed antioxidant activity in laboratory assays. Cells exposed to oxidative stress survived better in the presence of Mogroside extracts. This is not a medical claim. It is a biochemical observation, one that has prompted further study but does not, by itself, translate into health benefits for people who consume the fruit. From an agricultural perspective, the fruit remains difficult. It grows almost exclusively in Guangxi province, in the mountainous regions where karst topography creates the specific microclimate the vines require. Attempts to cultivate it in other parts of China and in other countries have largely failed. A few experimental plantings in Thailand and New Zealand have shown limited success, but yields remain low and quality variable. The vines are perennial, but they do not produce fruit for the first 3 years after planting. Once mature, they can produce for decades, but productivity depends on pollination. In wild populations, insects handle this. In commercial cultivation, hand pollination is often necessary to ensure adequate fruit set. Harvesting is done manually. The fruit matures over several weeks, and pickers must return to the same vines multiple times, selecting only ripe fruit. The ripe fruit is fragile. Rough handling causes bruising, which accelerates spoilage. Drying, the traditional method of preservation, has been supplemented by modern processing. Extraction facilities now take dried fruit and process it into concentrated Mogroside extracts. These extracts are standardized for sweetness, purified to remove off flavors, and sold as powders or liquids that can be added to foods and beverages. The extraction process is not simple. It involves soaking the dried fruit in water or alcohol, filtering, concentrating, and sometimes further purification with chromatography. The result is a product that contains up to 50% Mogrosides by weight, far more concentrated than the dried fruit itself. But even with modern technology, the bottleneck remains the fruit. Production is limited by how much can be grown, and cultivation has not scaled in the way that other crops have. The vines still require specific conditions. The climate still dictates where they can thrive, and the labor required to harvest and process the fruit still limits how much can be produced. Global demand, driven by markets in Europe, North America, and Japan, has increased, but supply has not kept pace. Prices remain high. Adulteration is common. Products labeled as monk fruit extract sometimes contain added sweeteners or are diluted with fillers. The fruit that was once a regional specialty known only in the mountains of Guangxi, has become a global commodity. But it has not become abundant. It remains constrained by the biology that kept it local for centuries. The fruit is called monk fruit. In Chinese, it is luo han guo, a hot fruit, named for the Buddhist monks who cultivated it. In English, the name reflects that history, though most consumers know it only as a sweetener, not as a fruit with a past. It grows today in the same region where it has always grown. The mountainous areas of Guangxi province remain the primary and nearly exclusive source. Small-scale farmers cultivate the vines on terraced hillsides, using methods that have changed little in essentials, though some modern inputs, trellises, pruning techniques, pest management, have been adopted. The fruit itself is round, slightly oblong, with a thin, hard shell that turns from green to brown as it ripens. The flesh inside is pale, juicy when fresh, and intensely sweet. But fresh monk fruit is almost never consumed outside the region where it grows. The fruit is too perishable. Instead, it is dried. The traditional method involves roasting the fruit over low heat, often in large woks, until the flesh dehydrates and the shell hardens. The dried fruit is dark brown, lightweight, and shelf-stable. It can be stored for years. To use it, the dried fruit is cracked open, the flesh and seeds are removed, and the pieces are boiled in water. The resulting tea is sweet, with a flavor that is clean, without the bitterness or aftertaste that characterizes some other natural sweeteners. The liquid can be consumed as is, or used to sweeten other foods. In modern commerce, monk fruit appears not as whole fruit but as extract. The dried fruit is processed to isolate the Mogrosides, which are then sold as a powder or liquid sweetener. These products are marketed to consumers seeking alternatives to sugar and artificial sweeteners. They are used in beverages, baked goods, protein powders, and other processed foods. The extract is heat-stable, which makes it useful for cooking and baking. It does not caramelize like sugar, so it cannot be used to make caramel or to brown the tops of baked goods. But it can replace sugar in recipes where sweetness, rather than texture or browning, is the goal. For those who want to grow it, the challenges are significant. The vines require a subtropical climate with high humidity, consistent rainfall, and protection from strong winds. They need support structures to climb. They need pollinators, or hand pollination. And they need patience, 3 years from planting to the first harvest. And even then, yields may be modest. Outside of Guangxi, successful cultivation is rare. The plant has not adapted to other climates. It has not been bred into varieties that tolerate different conditions. It remains, in a fundamental sense, a plant of its place. The knowledge of how to grow it, how to process it, how to extract the Mogrosides, that knowledge is no longer confined to the valleys where the fruit has always grown. It has been documented, studied, published. But the fruit itself remains tied to the land that has always sustained it. And it is still here, still growing on hillsides in Guangxi, still harvested by hand, still dried in the sun or over low fires, still producing a sweetness that requires no sugar, no calories, no metabolic cost, still difficult to grow, still difficult to process, still constrained by biology in ways that industrial agriculture has not solved. The knowledge was always here. It was written in Ming dynasty herbals, practiced in Buddhist monasteries, preserved in the hands of farmers who understood what the vines needed and what the fruit could give. We just never looked in the mountains.